Henri Delatour would live long enough to forget names, dates, and even the faces of people he had loved. But he never forgot the sound of that morning in 1914. It began as a distant murmur, a low vibration that crept across the fields like an approaching storm. At first, he thought it was the rumble of artillery drifting from the front, but soon he realized it was something different, rhythmic, synchronized, relentless. Thousands of boots striking the earth in perfect unison. A single monstrous heartbeat marching steadily toward Paris. Before the war, Henri had been nothing more extraordinary than a furniture delivery driver in the crowded streets of the capital. He knew engines better than rifles, and the scent of oil and wood polish better than the smell of gunpowder. His life had been predictable, small, and quietly comfortable. Yet the war had a way of dragging the ordinary into its jaws without permission. When the German armies punched through Belgium and thundered southward faster than anyone believed possible, France began calling not just for soldiers, but for every man who could move, lift, or drive. Henri's mobilization order arrived on a damp September morning, slid under the door like an intruder. His wife found it first. Neither of them spoke when she handed it to him. The message was clear. The front was collapsing toward the Marne, and Paris was no longer a distant spectator. Motorists were being absorbed into the army as urgently as ammunition. The Germans were less than 50 kilometers away. He reported to the assembly yard on the edge of Paris, where the air was thick with the smell of exhaust and panic. Civilian vehicles stood in crooked rose delivery trucks with their shop logos still painted on the sides. City buses stripped of seating, and long lines of stiff-jawed taxi drivers trying to hide their fear behind cigarettes. Officers barked names and orders that contradicted each other almost immediately. Henri's truck, a rattling Renault with peeling paint and a temperamental engine, was assigned to transport reinforcements toward the Marne. No map, no explanation, just a gesture pointing east as he climbed into the cab. He saw the benches installed hastily in the back. They looked too clean, too empty. Within hours, they would carry men whose boots were still polished and whose eyes had not yet learned the expression of those who understood the price of war. Henri wrote later that this was the first moment he felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Not heroism, just weight. The convoy rolled out at dusk, slipping through the streets of Paris as if the city itself were trying not to wake. Shopkeepers silently lowered their shutters. Women stood at windows clutching letters, watching the line of vehicles disappear into the night. For the first few kilometers, Henri still believed, or tried to believe, that he would be back within days. But then he heard it again, that distant, methodical rumble from beyond the horizon dot. It grew clearer as the convoy advanced into the countryside, where the sky flickered with the reflection of artillery fires. The road became crowded with refugees pushing carts, carrying bundles, guiding children by the wrist. Soldiers limped past on improvised crutches, their uniforms torn and faces hollow. One of them looked at Henri as he passed and muttered, "They're coming in columns." Endless columns. Henri didn't understand what the man meant, not yet. The convoy halted near a ridge overlooking the valley. Dawn was breaking, casting a pale light over the landscape. And then Henri saw it. A vast gray tide moving with mechanical precision. Line after line of German infantry marching south, stepping over fields as if nothing in the world could stop them. No hesitation, no disorder, just the steady, terrifying rhythm of an army certain of victory. It was in that moment, standing beside his truck with the cold morning air biting at his skin, that Henri Delatour understood the truth. Paris was hanging by a thread, and he, a driver who had never held a rifle in his life, had been pulled into the very moment that would decide whether France lived or died. That sound, the German boots striking the earth, would become the echo that followed him for the rest of his days. Asterisk. Henri Delatour would later say that if he closed his eyes, He could still hear those boots marching somewhere beyond the edge of memory. But the sound alone did not tell the whole story. To understand what happened on the day the Germans marched into fire, you had to go back a little, to the days when Paris finally understood how close the disaster really was. In early September 1914, the city lived in a strange tension between routine and collapse. Cafes still opened each morning, but the conversations inside had changed. Men no longer argued about football or politics. They leaned over crumpled newspapers, tracing the black arrows of the German advance across maps on the front page. Every day those arrows crept a little closer. Every day the rumors grew heavier. Some swore they had heard the guns during the night, a dull, distant rolling like storms on the horizon. Others claimed they had seen German cavalry on the outskirts, or spies signaling from church towers with lanterns. Most of it was fantasy, but the fear underneath was real. It showed in the way mothers kept their children closer than before, in the way conversations broke off whenever someone whispered Marne. For most of Henri's life, war had belonged to old men on benches and dusty medals in drawers. Now it was a shadow standing just beyond the edge of the city. Henri felt the change through his work. Deliveries were canceled with hurried apologies. Customers paid quickly, eyes drifting past him toward the street as if measuring the distance to some unseen threat. More uniforms appeared every day, more bandaged arms, more trains leaving the stations packed with men who waved as if leaving for a long but harmless journey. The posters still promised glory and a quick victory. The faces watching the trains depart no longer looked convinced. The order to requisition civilian vehicles came suddenly, like a curtain torn down. Notices went up overnight. Policemen went door to door with lists in their hands and urgency in their voices. Anyone who owned a bus, a truck, or even a sturdy car was ordered to present it for military service. Drivers were added to the rolls as if they were another kind of ammunition. Henri received his paper with the same single word stamped at the top as thousands of others. Immediately, that last evening at home felt strangely small, as if the walls had moved closer. His wife cooked and tried to talk about ordinary things, the leaking tap, the neighbor who had moved away, the price of coal, but every sentence seemed to end in the same silence. Henri checked his tools, folded a spare shirt into a small bag, and avoided the question in her eyes. They did not mention the Germans. They did not say the word Paris. Saying either out loud would make everything too real. When he finally lay down, he did not sleep. He listened instead. Hooves on cobblestone somewhere in the distance. A wagon rattling past. Voices low and hurried at the corner. Paris itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that refused to name itself. Dawn. The streets felt lighter, stripped of something he could not define. Many shutters were half closed. Those who were outside moved with purpose, speaking in short, quiet phrases. Outside the assembly yard, a crowd had gathered, wives, mothers, children, all hovering at the invisible line where the civilian world ended and the army began. Some cried openly. Others simply stared through the iron bars at the rows of vehicles inside, as if trying to memorize every shape and detail before it was gone. Beyond the gate, chaos fought to become order. Drivers clustered around their trucks and buses, clutching papers, calling out to officers who were too busy to answer. Mechanics crawled under engines, their hands already black with grease. Officers strode through the noise with clipboards and hoarse voices, shifting men and vehicles from one unit to another as new orders arrived. No one seemed to know the full plan. They only knew that everything and everyone was being pushed toward the Marne. Henri was assigned a truck with worn tires and a reluctant engine, but the machine felt like an old acquaintance. Same model as the one he used for deliveries. The familiar smell of oil, the way the clutch bit too high, the stubborn jump between first and second gear. In a morning where everything else had become strange, that familiarity felt like a rope he could grip with both hands. His first load was infantry. They climbed into the back with 2 heavy packs and clumsy jokes, banging rifles against the sideboards, pretending not to notice how their fingers trembled. Some were barely more than boys, uniforms still stiff with new cloth. Others had the quiet, heavy look of men who had already seen the front once and been sent back for more. One of them, older than the rest, adjusted his belt and tapped the side of the truck. "Where do you usually drive?" he asked. "Paris," Henri replied. "Then take us there and back again after this," the man said, forcing a faint smile. "My wife will be waiting." Henri nodded, but the words settled inside him like a stone. He had seen the casualty lists pinned outside the town hall. He knew the numbers were more than ink. Asterisk. The column rolled out of the yard, coughing smoke and dust. Bus followed truck, followed taxi, every vehicle loaded with men trying to sit comfortably on hard benches. Paris slid past in fragments, a baker frozen in his doorway, apron still dusted with flour, a priest lifting a hand in blessing as the convoy groaned past his church, a knot of children waving from a corner, their smiles too wide, too stiff. To Henri, every crossing and every familiar corner felt like a goodbye he had not prepared to say. On the outskirts, the city thinned and the countryside opened, already scarred by the passing of armies. Fields lay trampled and raw. Distant plumes of smoke rose from places that should have been quiet farms and villages. From time to time, the convoy overtook groups of refugees moving in the opposite direction. Carts piled high with furniture and bedding, old men leaning on canes, women with infants strapped to their backs. No one shouted. No one pleaded. They simply walked as if the only choice left to them was direction. The soldiers in the back of Henri's truck fell silent as they watched the procession moving past. Whatever illusions they had carried about banners and parades dissolved in the dust of that road. Somewhere ahead, beyond the low line of trees and the haze hanging over the fields, the Marne waited. Somewhere beyond the Marne, the marching German columns were closing in. Henri felt the engine vibrating beneath his hands, a steering wheel tugging slightly as they bounced over another stretch of broken ground. He did not know the general's plans or the precise names of the regiments fighting to slow the German tide. All he knew was that every kilometer he drove was pushing these men closer to a thin, fragile line that could not be allowed to break. Later he would remember that journey as a slow descent toward something he could not yet name. The sky was bright, the air still almost warm, but the whole world seemed to be leaning toward a single point in the distance, a place where all these vehicles, all these faces, would collide, and under it all, so faint at first that he thought he imagined it, there was that sound again, somewhere far ahead, beyond the fields and the smoke, the steady, endless rhythm of boots marching toward the river. Asterisk, asterisk, by the time Henri's convoy reached the northern bend of the Marne, the world had turned into a kind of organized confusion, something too structured to be called chaos, yet too frantic to resemble discipline. Officers hurried along the roadside with maps clutched in sweating hands, shouting new instructions that contradicted the ones given only minutes earlier. Columns shifted direction like herds startled by distant thunder, and no one seemed entirely sure where the front line actually was. Some said the Germans had crossed the Marne in 2 places. Others insisted they had not crossed at all. The only certainty was movement constant, urgent, disordered movement. Henri parked his truck in a makeshift staging area beside a small farmhouse that had been converted into a command post. Soldiers crowded around the well, filling canteens and splashing water on their faces. Horses stamped nervously, picking up on a tension that humans were too stubborn to acknowledge. From the open windows of the farmhouse came the muffled rumble of officers arguing, their voices rising and falling with the rapid scratching of pencils over maps. Every few minutes, a messenger burst out the door, mounted a horse, and disappeared down the road at a gallop. Henri waited beside his truck, unsure whether he should unload his passengers or keep them aboard. No one had told him anything. The men in the back tried to keep up their morale with half-hearted jokes, but their eyes betrayed the strain. A distant boom rolled across the fields, followed by another. Artillery closer than before. Finally, a lieutenant strode across the yard, boots crunching in the dry grass. He shouted for the infantry to disembark immediately, waving his arms toward a shallow ravine that served as a temporary assembly point. The soldiers clambered down, tightening straps and adjusting their rifles, no longer bothering with jokes. Before Henri could ask what he should do next, the lieutenant slapped a sheet of paper into his hand. Report to the bridge at Les Feux-Jouarre. Take whatever supplies they give you. Escort them to wherever the quartermaster assigns. And hurry. Henri opened his mouth to protest. The instructions were vague. The route unclear, but the officer was already gone. Consumed by another burst of orders shouted from the doorway of the farmhouse. He climbed back into the cab and started the engine. The Renault coughed, hesitated, then roared grudgingly to life. Henri guided the truck back onto the road, passing columns of troops marching in the opposite direction. Some looked exhausted, their uniforms torn and filthy. Others marched stiffly, jaws clenched, eyes fixed on the horizon. A few limped, refusing to break formation despite the obvious pain. As Henri continued eastward, the landscape changed. The neat farmland gave way to scorched patches where artillery shells had landed. Trenches dug in haste scarred the hillsides like open wounds. Abandoned wagons lay tilted in ditches, wheels shattered, their cargo spilled out like organs. The smell of smoke grew heavier, mingling with something sharper, metallic, sour. It clung to the back of Henri's throat. Near a crossroads, he found a cluster of military policemen directing the growing flood of vehicles. They moved with tense urgency, waving flags and blowing whistles, trying to force order on the tide of trucks, buses, ambulances, and artillery teams converging on the same narrow paths. When Henri lowered his window to ask for directions, one of the policemen leaned in, sweat dripping from his temple. Bridge at La Ferte. Keep going straight, but move fast. They say the Germans are pushing hard on the right flank. No one knows where they'll break through. Henri nodded and shifted gears. His knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Nothing looked secure. Roads clogged, units overlapping, officers contradicting each other. It felt less like a coordinated army than like a dam struggling to hold back a flood. He reached La Ferte near noon. The town was half deserted, its inhabitants long since fled. At the bridge, a group of quartermasters worked frantically, stacking crates of ammunition, water barrels, and medical supplies. They thrust a manifest into Henri's hands before he could speak. Take these to the 55th Infantry near Meaux. Follow the road until someone stops you. If you hear machine guns, you've gone too far. It was a joke, but delivered without a smile. Henri loaded what he could cases of rifle cartridges, canvas sacks of bread and dried meat, a crate marked with a red cross that he suspected held bandages or morphine. As he secured the cargo, he noticed the bridge trembling slightly under the weight of troops rushing across it. Officers shouted for speed. Horses snorted anxiously. The river below glimmered, quiet and indifferent. When he climbed back into the driver's seat, Henri felt a strange sensation settle over him, not fear exactly, but an awareness that every direction held danger. Wherever he drove next, he would be moving into a narrowing space between armies closing like jaws. The road toward Meaux twisted between low hills and thickets of trees. Henri could hear gunfire now, sharp, irregular, rising and falling in bursts. Once or twice he thought he saw movement along the ridgelines, dark shapes slipping between trees. But he could not be sure if they were French scouts or German advance units. Near a bend in the road, a sudden explosion shook the earth. Henri slammed the brakes as a geyser of dirt erupted just ahead, showering the truck with stones. For a moment he sat frozen, hands gripping the wheel, heart hammering against his ribs. Then he forced himself to breathe, shifted back into gear, and crawled forward past the smoking crater dot. It struck him then, with cold clarity. He was no longer just delivering supplies. He was inside the war now, not watching it from a distance, but inching along its edge. One wrong turn away from being swallowed whole, and somewhere further east, beyond the next ridge, lay the lines where the real fighting was unfolding, the place where Henri would soon witness the moment that would define everything that happened on the Marne. The closer Henri drew to Meaux, the more the war revealed itself not as lines on a map, but as a living thing breathing, thrashing, expanding with every hour. The road that should have been quiet countryside was choked with movement in both directions. Columns of infantry hurrying forward in uneven steps. Columns of wounded dragging themselves back, some supported by comrades. Others carried on stretchers stained brown with dried blood. Horses bucked nervously at the smell of smoke drifting across the fields. And over everything hung a haze that blurred the horizon, like a fever dream. Henri's truck rattled over another stretch of broken cobblestone, the crates behind him clattering like teeth chattering in fear. Every turn brought new obstacles. An overturned ammunition wagon, a dead horse stiffening in the ditch. A group of refugees clustered beneath a tree with the hollow-eyed stillness of people who had run out of places to run. Children stared silently as he passed. Women clutched bundles of clothes in red, the remnants of lives scattered by the advancing storm. For a long stretch, the gunfire ahead grew sharper. Individual cracks punctuated the air, followed by the distant rhythmic thumping of machine guns. The soldiers he carried earlier had joked about their first taste of battle. Hearing the harsh stutter of weapons meant to tear men apart, Henri wondered how many of them remained alive now. He pushed the thought away, gripping the wheel tighter. Near a crossing where the road dipped between two ridges, military police tried to control the chaos. They shouted orders drowned out by the din redirecting artillery carts, waving cavalry units forward, forcing civilian wagons to turn back. One policeman stepped in front of Henri's truck, raised a hand, and leaned into the window. Supplies for the 55th Infantry? They're forming up near the river bend. Follow the road until the orchards. But be careful, shells are landing all over this sector. He stepped back just as a dull explosion rolled across the valley, shaking dust from the trees. Henri nodded and drove on Dot as he approached the orchards. The landscape seemed to tighten around him. The trees stood in uneven rows, branches singed by stray embers from earlier bombardments. Here and there, piles of abandoned gear marked where units had regrouped or scattered. A broken rifle leaned against a tree trunk. A helmet lay half buried in churned soil. Its strap torn. Henri stopped briefly at a fork in the road, unsure which direction led to the infantry. Before he could decide, a runner in a torn uniform sprinted toward him, gasping for breath. "Are you the supply truck?" The man wheezed. Good. Keep going east. The line's bending back. We need the ammunition now." Henri shifted gears and continued, heart pounding. The runner's panic had cut through him like a blade. If the line was bending, it meant the Germans were pushing dangerously close. The smoke thickened as he neared the river bend. The air grew hotter, carrying the sharp tang of burning canvas and wet earth. As the truck crept over a rise, Henri suddenly had a clear view of the valley below, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. The countryside, once peaceful and spacious, had become a vast tangle of trenches, shattered trees, and scattered groups of soldiers firing toward a line of hedges in the distance. French infantry hugged the ground as shells burst around them, sending up columns of dirt and flame. Officers shouted, waving their swords or pistols as signals lost in the roar of battle. A medical team crouched beside a wounded man who screamed whenever they tried to move him. Henri had transported furniture through Paris for years, maneuvering carts through narrow alleys and crowds. But nothing in his life had prepared him to drive through a battlefield. Still, he forced the truck forward, inch by inch, until he reached a cluster of soldiers loading magazines behind a half-collapsed stone wall. They rushed to unload the crates as soon as he stopped, their hands trembling, their movements urgent. One of them gripped Henri's arm. "Get out of here," the soldier said. "They've got machine guns sweeping the orchard. If you stay, you'll be cut in half." Henri nodded. His throat was too dry to answer. He reversed the truck carefully, trying not to stall the engine as the ground shook from another barrage. When he reached the safety of the ridge above the valley, he stopped the truck and turned off the engine. He sat in silence, staring at the smoke drifting upward like torn banners. It was then he realized something strange. The gunfire to the east sharp, and heavy moments before, had begun to shift. Less chaotic now, more distant, more controlled. Other soldiers on the ridge seemed to notice it too. A murmur spread among them as they adjusted their field glasses. Someone shouted that the Germans were advancing again. Advancing in great numbers. Henri stepped out of the truck, drawn almost unwillingly to the crest of the ridge. And there, beyond the haze, he saw them, gray columns moving with deadly precision, marching in lines so straight they looked drawn with a ruler. The sun caught the glint of their bayonets like a sheet of metal descending across the land. They were coming forward, unbroken, unstoppable, marching directly toward the French guns and toward the fire waiting for them. Henri felt the ground tremble beneath his boots. The echo returned stronger than ever, the same terrible rhythm he had heard on that first morning. Only now it was not distant. Now it was coming for them. The ridge beneath. Henri's boots seemed to pulse with each synchronized step of the approaching German columns. It was a sound too vast for the human mind to fully grasp, as if the earth itself were being beaten into submission by an iron rhythm. The morning light, hazed by drifting smoke, cast the long gray formations into a ghostly procession, disciplined, steady, terrifying in their certainty. They advanced without urgency, without hesitation, as though the fields, the orchards, and the men defending them were nothing more than obstacles in a parade route. Henri had never seen an army move like that. Each regiment flowed behind the next, perfectly aligned, bayonets angled upward like a forest of needles. Officers rode along the flanks, calmly gesturing with sabers, their horses snorting at the acrid air. Drummers kept the pace. Even from a distance, Henri could sense the confidence radiating from them, the belief that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. They were the same invincible force that had crushed Belgium, broken through the Sambre, marched across France with unstoppable momentum. But today, they were marching into something else entirely. Down in the valley, the French line stiffened. Infantrymen scrambled behind shattered walls and the jagged edges of hastily dug trenches. Machine gun crews adjusted their tripods, checking their belts with trembling fingers. Artillery observers perched behind mounds of rubble, calling back new coordinates as the enemy columns came into range. The officers' voices rose above the noise-orderly words, delivered with brittle steel in them. Henri watched as a battery of French guns near the river swung into position. The crews moved with rehearsed precision, ramming shells into the breaches, slamming them shut, stepping back. A tense silence seemed to settle across the battlefield, broken only by the marching that now felt impossibly close. Then came the first French shot. A single boom tore through the air. echoing off the hills in a rolling wave. The shell soared overhead in a slow, graceful arc before plunging into the center of one of the advancing German battalions. Fire, earth, and bodies erupted into the sky. The explosion tore a hole in the perfect formation, yet the gray mass behind it closed the gap almost instantly, as if swallowing the destruction without breaking stride. More guns fired. The ridge shook beneath Henri as blast after blast launched fiery arcs toward the valley. Each hit tore deeper into the advancing ranks. Some men fell. Others stumbled, corrected themselves, and kept marching. It was madness, an unstoppable machine pressing forward through storms, meant to annihilate it. Machine guns opened next, sputtering with a sharp, metallic fury that cut the air like tearing cloth. The bullets stitched across the German front, ripping through lines, dropping men in clumps. Yet still they advanced. Officers bellowed commands, waving their units onward, even as the ground grew littered with those who would not rise again. Henri felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was not courage he was witnessing. It was something colder, read into an army convinced of destiny. They pushed forward as if pain were irrelevant, as if death were simply a price to be tallied later. But the French were no longer the disoriented, retreating force of days earlier. They fought now with the desperation of men defending the last gateway to their capital. Their rifles cracked in relentless volleys. Their machine guns spat fire until the barrels glowed. Their artillery hammered the valley with mechanical determination. The line bent, but did not break. Henri stepped closer to the crest, unable to tear his eyes away. Smoke drifted across the field like gauze, revealing and concealing shapes in chaotic rhythm. Through one thinning curtain of haze, he saw a German regiment falter. A momentary hesitation, only a heartbeat long. A captain shouted, lifting his saber. The men tightened their formation and surged forward again. Asterisk, asterisk, but something fundamental had changed. The columns, once moving with unshakable order, now wavered. Their lines buckled under the relentless fire pouring from the French positions. Gaps widened faster than they could be filled. Officers fell. Flags slipped from numb fingers. And still the French guns roared. Henri realized then why the sound of marching had haunted him for the rest of his life. It was not the sound of power. It was the sound of fate thousands of men walking toward a fire they could not see, could not comprehend, and could not escape. A massive barrage thundered from the French batteries. Shells burst across the front ranks, tearing open the earth in violent flashes. For the first time, the German advance stalled. Men dropped to the ground, not to charge, but to seek cover. Officers waved frantically, trying to restore order to a formation that no longer existed. The unstoppable tide had finally met something immovable. Henri felt his breath shudder. For the first time since the war began, he sensed that the German advance was not inevitable. It could be resisted. It could be held. But even as hope stirred in him, the valley erupted into a new frenzy of fire. The Germans, wounded but not defeated, began preparing for another push. Henri stepped back from the ridge, heartbeat echoing the fading rhythm of boots. The day was far from over. Asterisk. As the sun slid behind the hills and the smoke thickened into a heavy curtain over the valley, Henri felt the first hints of night settling over the battlefield. But darkness did not bring quiet. Instead, it brought movement, restless, hurried, purposeful movement. Orders rolled through the ranks like gusts of wind, and the frantic energy of the day twisted into something sharper. The Germans had stalled, but not stopped. Everyone knew they would attack again at dawn, and the French needed reinforcements before the gray tide surged once more. Henri was climbing back into his truck when a breathless officer grabbed his arm. "Driver!" "New orders. Return to Paris immediately. They're gathering every vehicle they can find." Troops must be moved tonight. Henri stared at him, unsure he'd heard correctly. Return to Paris? Now? The officer didn't wait for an answer. He simply shoved a paper into Henri's hand and pointed west. The road back toward the capital felt surreal. Only hours earlier it had been clogged with soldiers pushing toward the Marne. Now it flowed in reverse with a strange new urgency. Headlights winked through the gathering darkness as civilian vehicles of every shape rumbled eastward. Buses, delivery vans, private cars, and most striking of all, the bright red Renault Taxis of Paris, their meters still attached as if they were on their way to pick up passengers after the opera. Henri merged into the tide of engines and exhaust, swept along by the momentum of something far larger than himself. Officers shouted directions at intersections, guiding the convoy with flashlights and glowing lanterns. Civilians leaned out their windows to gape as hundreds of taxis streaked toward the front, their drivers focused and grim. At the Porte Maillot, Henri reached the rendezvous point. Troops from the 7th Infantry Brigade waited in tight columns, their silhouettes stark under the street lamps. Many looked exhausted, barely recovered from earlier marches, but their expressions held a fierce determination that Henri had not seen before. They boarded the taxis and trucks with quiet efficiency, as if fully aware that this strange operation, this patchwork convoy of city vehicles, was their chance to stand between Paris and ruin. A captain signaled Henri forward. 12 infantrymen clambered into the back of his truck, boots thudding against the wooden planks. They tightened straps and checked their rifles as if preparing for a ritual rather than battle. When Henri glanced back at them, one soldier offered a faint smile. "Don't worry, driver. We'll keep you alive." It was meant as a joke, but it sounded more like a promise made to himself. The convoy departed just past midnight. Engines rumbled in uneven harmony, headlights carving long beams through the mist. Paris slowly receded behind them, until the last street lamp vanished and the countryside swallowed the road. The night air smelled of damp earth and distant fire. Occasionally, a flash lit the horizon, followed seconds later by the low rumble of artillery. Inside his cab, Henri felt time stretch strangely. The soldiers behind him murmured among themselves, speaking softly about families left behind, letters not yet written, meals they hoped to eat when the war ended. No one mentioned fear. No one spoke of death. Perhaps the darkness made it easier to imagine they were simply travelers on a long road, heading toward a place where dawn would bring something other than violence. But dawn would bring the Germans as they approached the Marne again. The glow of burning farmhouses illuminated the fields. Columns of troops already engaged in the fighting moved aside to let the convoy pass, some raising weary hands in greeting. The closer they drew to the front, the louder the guns became, until the very air vibrated with each distant detonation. At a crossroads, a military policeman waved Henri to a halt. The officer leaned into the window, his face smeared with grime. "Drop the men near the Orchard Ridge. After that, return for another wave. We're bringing everyone tonight. Paris must hold. The Germans cannot advance at dawn." Henri nodded. He didn't know whether Paris would hold, but he knew that tonight the army was pouring every last ounce of strength into making sure it did. He resumed driving, feeling the road narrow beneath his wheels. When he stopped near the ridge, the soldiers jumped out silently and vanished into the shadows, swallowed by the organized chaos of preparing defenses. One turned back briefly and touched the side of the truck, as if thanking it for carrying him this far. And then Henri was alone again. He sat for a moment, gripping the wheel, listening to the distant guns. He thought of Paris, its cafes, its laughter, its quiet streets before dawn, of the thousands of drivers racing through the night to deliver the men who would defend it. This strange armada of vehicles, this improvised force of wheels and engines, was now part of the war as surely as rifles and cannons. And Henri, who had once carried wardrobes and crates of chairs, now carried the fate of a city. He turned the truck around, shifting gears with a steadiness he did not feel, and began the return journey. The night stretched endlessly ahead, lit by fire and fear. But he would make the trip again and again until ordered to stop dot, because now he understood the truth. Every soldier delivered to the Marne was a stone in the fragile wall, holding back the German tide. And if that wall broke, there would be nowhere left to retreat. By the second night of shuttling men and supplies toward the Marne, Henri no longer felt like he was driving a truck. He felt as though he were piloting a small, fragile shell through a storm determined to crush it. Every trip grew more dangerous. Artillery fire now reached roads that had been safe hours earlier. Shells fell unpredictably, as if the sky itself were choosing random places to tear open. And yet, Henri kept going along with hundreds of other drivers, whose only armor was darkness and luck dot just before dawn. A lieutenant intercepted him at a crossroads and thrust a clipboard against his chest. "You, driver, take this load directly to the forward trench. They're nearly out of ammunition." Henri glanced at the crates. Rifle cartridges and 2 boxes marked for the machine gun companies. Precious lifelines. The lieutenant lowered his voice. "Bring these, or they won't hold the ridge. The Germans are preparing another push. Go as far as you can before daylight." Henri didn't argue. He started the engine and followed a narrow lane that twisted through burned orchards and ruined cottages. The road trembled under distant gunfire. Stars still clung faintly to the sky, but dawn lurked just below the horizon, spreading a pale, merciless glow. The deeper he went, the more the landscape dissolved into a battlefield stripped of anything familiar. Trenches zigzagged like open wounds carved into the earth. Craters pocked the ground with jagged rims. Abandoned gear helmets, broken rifles, torn satchels lay, scattered like remnants of storms long past. Bodies, covered hastily with blankets, lined the edge of the road. Henri forced himself not to look too closely. When he reached a shallow ridge that dipped toward the forward line, a burst of machine gun fire cut through the dawn. The crackling sound echoed sharply, bouncing across the valley like snapping wires. French troops crouched behind a splintered barricade waved frantically for him to stop. Supplies? Here. Hurry. They swarmed around the truck, heaving open the crates. Henri jumped down to help, his legs trembling with the strain of 2 sleepless nights. The soldiers tore open boxes of cartridges, loading bandoliers with frantic efficiency. Then, without warning, the air itself seemed to split apart. A shell landed somewhere to the right too close. The explosion punched the ground with a violent force that lifted Henri off his feet and slammed him against the side of the truck. Dirt rained down on him. His ears rang. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Shouts erupted around him. Another shell screamed overhead, its whining descent tightening the muscles in every man who heard it. The blast came even closer, showering them with clods of earth and scraps of metal. "Driver, get out of here!" Someone yelled. They'd spotted the road. "Move!" Henri scrambled back into the cab, blood trickling from a small cut above his eyebrow. His hands shook so violently he could barely grip the wheel. He had to reverse slowly, carefully, but panic clawed at him. Another shell struck, closer still. The truck rocked violently. A soldier threw himself into a ditch, screaming for Henri to go. Henri shifted gears and pressed the accelerator. The truck lurched backward, tires skidding on loose soil. For an agonizing moment, it felt as though the engine might stall. Then another explosion tore open the ground ahead, throwing up a wall of fire and dust that blotted out the road. Henri flinched, braking hard. He was trapped forward blocked, backward uncertain. Smoke poured over the cab, thick and choking. He heard metal pinging as shrapnel peppered the chassis. This is it, he thought. I'm not leaving this place. The thought didn't come with fear, only a profound, heavy finality. The world narrowed to the trembling of the steering wheel beneath his fingers and the core thunder of his own heartbeat. Another shell whistled in so close it felt aimed directly at him, but it overshot, slamming into the hillside and sending a rain of stones bouncing down the slope. Through the smoke, Henry saw a small opening to his left, a muddy track barely visible, perhaps once part of a farmer's cart path. He didn't think. He simply turned the wheel and drove. The truck jolted violently as it plunged off the main road, wheels skidding through mud and debris. Branches scraped the sides. Twice the truck nearly tipped. The engine wailed, straining under the abuse. But somehow, impossibly, it kept moving until the explosions began to fade behind him. When he finally reached a sheltered lowland, Henry killed the engine and slumped forward, gripping the wheel as if anchoring himself to existence. His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands would not stop shaking. He had delivered men to the front. He had brought ammunition that would keep the line from collapsing. But this was the first time he had felt the war reach inside the truck and try to drag him into its jaws. And he knew the day was not finished. Not for him. Not for anyone on the Marne. Out somewhere behind the smoke, the Germans were regrouping. And somewhere ahead, the French were preparing for the moment when everything would hinge on one final push. Henry wiped the blood from his brow, restarted the engine, and turned the truck south, toward whatever waited next. Henry did not remember exactly when the sound of the guns began to change. It did not happen with a single moment, a single shot, but gradually, like a storm drifting away while you were still braced beneath it. For hours the thunder had been constant, pressing against his skull, shaking the bones of the truck as he drove back and forth between scattered depots and the fractured line. Then, sometime in the late afternoon, he realized there were pauses now short at first, then longer, pockets of silence opening where there had been none. He was returning from another supply run. The cab spattered with mud and smoke when he stopped on a rise near the ridge where he had once watched the German columns advance. Exhaustion sat on his shoulders like a lead cloak. His whole body ached from the strain of the last days. But something in the air made him step down from the truck and walk toward the crest. The valley looked different. The smoke was still there, drifting in dirty veils across the fields, but the movement beneath it had changed. The neat, implacable gray lines that had marched with such certainty were gone. In their place, smaller groups shifted in uneven patterns, some pulling back, some digging in, some carrying stretchers toward the rear. French units, too, were moving, but with a new sureness, like men who had reached the edge of a cliff and discovered they had not fallen. He watched as a German battery limbered its guns and began to withdraw, horses straining against the weight of the metal. Further along the line, he saw what at first looked like another advance. But the direction was wrong. The gray coats were moving away, not forward, stepping back from positions they had bled to take. For a long moment, Henry simply stood there, trying to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. The German army, which for weeks had done nothing but come closer, was now receding. A captain appeared beside him, boots dusty, face streaked with grime and sweat. He followed Henry's gaze and gave a short, humorless laugh. "They didn't expect us to hold," the officer said. "They thought Paris would be a door left half open. But the Marne slammed it in their faces." Henry glanced at him. "Are we winning?" The captain's expression tightened, as if the word were too simple for what lay before them. Fields torn open, rivers muddied with blood, villages reduced to broken walls. "We're not losing," he answered at last. "For today, that's enough." Messages began to ripple through the ranks as evening approached. The Germans were pulling back to the Aisne, the great advance that had sliced through. Belgium and northern France had been stopped. Some men cheered. Others simply sagged where they stood, too drained to do anything more than light a cigarette with shaking hands. Henri returned to his truck when an orderly came, running with new instructions. No more frantic runs to the forward trenches. No more desperate dashes under shells. For now, his task was to help move the wounded to safer positions and carry fresh supplies to units holding the newly stabilized line. It sounded almost peaceful compared to the hell of the previous days. It was not peaceful. As night fell over the Marne, the battlefield revealed its true cost. Lanterns bobbed along the trenches and across the fields as stretcher bearers searched for those still breathing among the fallen. Cries of pain rose and fell in the dark, some close, others carried faintly on the wind. The smell of burned wood and spent powder mingled with something heavier, coppery. Final. Henri loaded his truck again, and again men with bandaged heads, arms in slings, legs hastily splitted with strips of wood. Some stared blankly at nothing. Others clutched rosaries or letters spotted with blood. One young soldier, no older than 18, grabbed Henri's sleeve as they lifted him into the truck. "Did we stop them?" The boy asked. Henri hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, we stopped them." The boy closed his eyes and whispered, "Then it was worth it," as if saying it aloud might it true. Near midnight, when the last of the wounded for that sector had been moved, Henri finally allowed himself to sit on the running board of his truck and do nothing. The guns still rumbled in the distance, but the sound no longer felt like a great wave rushing forward. It was more distant, flattened, as though something immense had hit an invisible wall and broken its momentum. He thought of Paris, of the cafes, the houses, the streets where taxis still waited at curbs. He pictured his wife standing at the window of their small apartment, listening for news, for footsteps on the stairs. The Germans had not reached her. Their boots had not echoed in his neighborhood. For the first time since receiving his mobilization order, he allowed himself to believe they might not. Years later, when he sat at a plain wooden table with a notebook open before him, Henri struggled to find words that could contain what he had seen. How could ink capture the sight of an invincible army dissolving under fire? How could lines on a page explain the way time had slowed as those gray columns marched into a valley they believed was theirs, only to be shattered by a nation's last effort? He wrote about the trucks and taxis racing through the night, about the officers who gave orders even when their voices trembled, about the men in the back of his truck who tried to joke on the way to the front, and the silence in which they returned, or did not return at all. He described the sound of boots marching toward the river, and how the earth itself seemed to hold its breath when the first shells fell among them. Most of all, he wrote about that single truth the Marne had taught him, that even the greatest advance can be turned, not by grand speeches or perfect plans, but by countless small acts of courage by drivers who kept going when the roads turned to fire, by soldiers who held a line that seemed certain to break, by a country that refused to step aside and let the tide pass. On the cover of his notebook, in a hand made unsteady by age, he finally wrote the only title that felt honest: "The Day the Germans Marched into Fire." He put down his pen and listened. In the quiet of his small room, far from the valleys and rivers of 1914, he could still hear it if he let himself remember, the rhythm of thousands of boots, the roar of the French guns, and the moment when the march that had crossed half of Europe finally faltered and stopped. For the world, history would call it the First Battle of the Marne. The moment when the German drive on Paris was broken and the long, bitter years of trench warfare began. For Henri Delatour, it would always be something simpler and heavier. It was the day he watched an army walk straight into the fire, and the day he understood that sometimes, against all reason, the fire can be made to hold.